All right, we are going to go over, likely for the final time ever, Gavin's arguments against the bodily assumption of Mary.
In this video,
now, why do we say for likely the last time ever? Well, really, there's not a whole lot of new material or really anything new under the sun that Gavin hasn't already talked about before in other videos. We've dealt with it before. We've refuted him over and over. Gavin has told me flat out he doesn't want to engage with my Mariology material, and Gavin won't debate me. As we've noted before many times, we've offered Gavin the moderator of his choosing, the format of his choosing. Gavin doesn't want to debate because Gavin knows very well that he is out of his depth, out of his element when it comes to Mariology. This is not his field at all, so doesn't want to talk about it, doesn't want to debate, but he will churn out video after video. Now, my reply here is a little bit late because I am backed up in replies, prepping for debates, writing books. I got a lot to my plate, including preparing for courses that I am teaching. So just really backed up. So it took a little bit of time to come out with this video. Thank the good Lord we are here. It will be probably a 2 or 3 part refutation. And probably will be the last time unless Gavin decides to criticize, to attack another Marian dogma. Likely when a feast day comes around, he will become very nervous that the Catholics will become very vocal about honoring Holy Mother Mary and worrying about the Protestants becoming Catholic. So he'll probably wait for another solemnity to attack our Holy Mother Mary, and we'll be ready to reply then when that time does come. December is around the corner, so he'll probably come out with something on the Immaculate Conception there. We've already replied to him on that, though, so hopefully we'll get something new. Whether or not he engages our material, it doesn't really matter. Because God willing, you all are edified by it. But we're going to dive in. We're going to look at the video a little piece by piece, because we want to cover everything in depth. We really want to look at everything that Gavin really does have to say about the bodily assumption. And we're going to dive in now.
I'm going to lay out a Protestant concern about the bodily assumption of Mary. First, what I'll do is explain the importance of this topic and why it's appropriate to address. Second, I'll summarize the argument against the assumption. And then third, I'll respond to 6 common defenses that I've heard. Number 1, that I'm making an argument from silence. Number 2, that I'm being inconsistent for rejecting the assumption, but accepting other late beliefs.
Okay, how about we dig in now? The number 1, we do want to be very respectful of our Protestant friends, those that are at least really in it for the truth, those that are really concerned about these kinds of teachings, our evangelical friends that are honest, at least. And what do I mean by we want to be respectful? Well, we realize that by and large, our evangelical friends and Protestant interlocutors, they go by the slogan of sola scriptura. So if you don't find it or you cannot find it in the Bible, well, they'll reject it, even though they don't really know that the whole premise of that lays behind sola scriptura is a convoluted mess. But with that being said, we make the case, and we've been making the case for years now, that the bodily assumption of Holy Mary is typologically biblical and strongly pointed to in the book of Revelation. That will be in another video, though. So we believe you can find the biblical basis for it there. And then the basis is more fleshed out when we get to sacred tradition. So we want to be very clear on that. But our evangelical friends very often, those that are honest about it, very often are unable to realize that Holy Mary is present there in Revelation 12. Thus, they are unable to get off the ground when it comes to dialoguing, talking about this issue. We want to be very clear. Biblically, we believe it has its basis in the Bible. We just debated this issue. Thank the good Lord. The response was tremendous. You all really did appreciate that. So praise God, all glory to God. Now we are diving in here, dealing with the majority of the issue here has to do with the historicity of this belief. Now, Gavin is going to make a statement in a bit that we thought was a bit odd. Let's go to that.
Because that's lying, and lying stains your conscience. Okay, second section. Why don't we think this is true? Let me summarize some of the points I've gone into more fully in 2 previous videos, which are linked in the video description. Just an overview. Now, in what follows, I'm going to reference scholarship. Sometimes people strangely fault me for this, but I think they have a kind of naive anti-scholarship mentality. I'll hear people who say, oh, don't read the scholars, just read the primary sources. But the only way we can read the primary sources is through scholarship, through critical editions of texts.
Yeah, I want to be very clear that never, ever have I ever heard any Catholic say, well, don't read any of the scholars or only stick to the primary first-hand source material. No, I think that you need to look at both. Look at those that are biased and those that are unbiased. So we are not against scholarship. I work with the top Mariologist in the world, probably the top scholar in the Mariology field. I've done show after show after show with the top Dormition scholars. So we're not anti-scholarship at all. What we don't like, though, is when Gavin presents people that are not scholars on the Assumption as scholars. Eamon Duffy's not an Assumption scholar. He's not even a Mariology scholar, but he's presented as one. What we don't appreciate is when the material is really slanted or we believe misrepresented. Now, we're going to see very clearly that we don't think Gavin is fair with the material. We think Gavin's goal is to keep people Protestant. Now, do we believe that Gavin is outright dishonest and a liar? Well, I've never once said that, but I don't think that he is very fair in the way he presents material. Now, I think Gavin is convinced of his position, without a doubt. I think he is. He's convinced of it. Do I think that he is convinced of it from a historical patristic perspective? No, I don't. Otherwise, I don't think Gavin would present the material the way he does in the patristic period. In my opinion, it's a mess the way he presents it. And I don't think he's fair in the way he presents it either. We want to be very clear there when it comes to the patristic material. I don't think Gavin is out there trying to flat out be this kind of figure that is telling people, hey, I know it all, remain Protestant, don't become Catholic. But I think he is trying to present a case where he's trying to seem fair without trying to say, hey, don't become Catholic, stay Protestant. That really is his goal. He's trying to present a fair case, but I don't think he's fair in his assessment because the overwhelming evidence is against him. The scholarship is against him. He doesn't have scholarship on his side when it comes to this. I want to be very clear. Gavin Ortlund does not have scholarship on his side when it comes to this. We're going to hear him, and we're going to look at numerous clips, and we're going to realize what I do every year when the Feast of the Dormition, the bodily Assumption of Holy Mary roll around. I do shows with my dear friends, the great Reverend Dr. Koppes, the great Dr. Brock, the great Reverend Dr. Daly. I've communicated with Dr. Katutz over and over. I've communicated with Dr. Shoemaker. I do shows with the top Dormition scholars in the world every year. It's a tradition I have. And I debate it every year. It's a tradition I have. And I can tell you right now, those top scholars on the Assumption of Mary, they don't agree with Gavin Ortlund at all. Gavin will frame it as, well, I told Shoemaker to look at my material. And, he had no issue with my video. He said, yeah, I was right in my conclusion. On what issue did he agree with you with, Gavin? Because we're going to look in a moment, and we're going to realize that in Dr. Shoemaker's latest published book on the Assumption of Mary, he doesn't agree with you. Doesn't agree with you.
One can possibly be just generally anti-scholarship any more than anyone can accept all scholarship.
I agree with Gavin on that point, no doubt. But what I don't agree with is that I don't think Gavin presents the scholarly material in a fair way. I don't think he does. We're going to see why in a moment.
We all have to critically distinguish between good and bad scholarship. Now, my purpose in referencing scholarship is not just to say, well, therefore it's settled. Just the opposite. It's to provoke people to look into it and to consider and say, why is all the scholarship going that route? So I'm going to talk a lot about Roman Catholic scholarship in this video. One of the points that I've made is that it appears to be something close to a scholarly consensus that the Assumption of Mary only comes into the church in the late 5th century.
Okay. That they believe venerated our mother by then. Some of these homilies teaching about her all immaculate nature in the very same vein as talking about her being mother of God, the Dormition, the Assumption, and her being perpetual virgin. I mean, just they're loaded with Mariology, aren't they?
Right? Absolutely. And to me, one of the interesting things is that this is first expressed in devotion, in liturgy, in prayer. And we know that it was a focus of liturgy from the 2nd century. And then it's expressed in narration, in stories. And then finally, it's kind of analyzed and explained in homilies.
So you don't have the great, oh, I forgot to put my video back on. How do I get that back on? There we go. So you don't have the great Reverend Dr. Daly agreeing with Gavin here. He argues and believes, just the way Dr. Catoots, just the way, even though Shoemaker says could be 2nd, could be 3rd. I think he goes around the 3rd century in his latest book. Catoots argues 2nd century. Dr. Daly, the Reverend Dr. Daly, like other scholars, many German scholars believe this originates from the 2nd century, liturgically. So the idea that you're telling me that scholarship is focusing on this being so late in history, what do you do with Ephraim the Syrian? What do you do with Jacob of Sarug? Oh, well, you said 5th century. You'd be okay with Jacob of Sarug then, right? But what do you do with the great Ephraim the Syrian? So, and by the way, let me correct that. You wouldn't even be okay with Jacob of Sarug. I'm wrong there. You try and argue that Jacob doesn't believe in the bodily assumption, even though in a moment we're going to see the greatest living scholar of Jacob. There's no greater one. The Dr. Brock doesn't agree with you there. So we want to talk about the top scholars in the world. They're not on your side, Gavin. They don't agree with you.
Between 450 and 500 after the Council of Chalcedon. This is Stephen Shoemaker's summary. I'll put it up. He's a highly respected scholar working in this field. I won't read this. You can see this and numerous other quotes in my original videos. By the way, I am not misrepresenting him. People sometimes wrongly accuse me of that.
So notice the one thing that Shoemaker has always said. He is very clear that there is not a unified tradition, and we can agree with that in the terms of there are multiple diverse narratives. There's no argument there. But to argue that this enters the church at such a late period, no, scholarship does not back you up there.
Book, it accords with numerous other passages, and I've emailed him to ask him to review my video to make sure that I'm summarizing him accurately, which he did.
So continuing right there, again, what did he tell you was accurate in your video? I would love to know, because the claim of it originated in Gnosticism is not correct. The only thing Shoemaker would have agreed with you on, Gavin, is the idea of there not being a fixed narrative until later. We don't have a problem with that. There are many pious kinds of stories circulating of people wondering, okay, what happened? We know that Holy Mary died. She was all holy, all immaculate. She died and was body and soul assumed into heaven. But they then begin to theologize, or imagine poetic ways and in their poetic prose as to how that could have occurred. So in that way, it's not a fixed narrative. We can agree with that particular point. Here's another thing. We want to rewind a little bit, because here's a plain truth. Gavin, over and over, will tell you that, look, you're accusing me of misrepresenting him, but I've read him and I've reached out to him and he's told me that I'm not misrepresenting him. No, he hasn't. Because I contacted him. And I can put the email up here. I contacted him and I asked him, in terms of orthodoxy, do you still hold to the Dormition narratives being orthodox in their theology? Of course, I'm not referring to the ones that talk about a sinful Joseph and Mary, which clearly come from heterodox groups, which no Catholic would hold to, which all of the early fathers condemned. No, I'm talking about the ones that early fathers would have quoted from, not the heretical ones. But you're telling me you've read Shoemaker, and then you're telling me you're not misrepresenting him, but then you say things like this.
After the Council of Chalcedon. This is Stephen Shoemaker's summary. I'll put it up. He's a highly respected scholar working in this field. I won't read this. You can see this and numerous other quotes in my original videos. By the way, I am not misrepresenting him. People sometimes wrongly accuse me of that. This is a summary passage of the thesis of his book. It accords with numerous other passages, and I've emailed him to ask him to review my video to make sure that I'm summarizing him accurately, which he did. Shoemaker also suggests in about 6 or 8 other passages, I'll just put up one of them, that the assumption first appears to show up among Gnostic groups. And on pages 23 and 24 and 25 of this same book that I'm citing right here, he references widespread agreement about that point in the scholarship.
So our criticism is very clear, because had Gavin been aware that the fact that scholarship does not lean in this direction at all. Dr. Katutz will tell you that it's not the case. Dr. Brock will tell you that. Reverend Dr. Daly will tell you that. And Shoemaker's brand new book will tell you that. His brand new book will tell you that very issue that we just brought up. Although in some earlier publications, I propose that the Book of Mary's Repose should be identified with ancient Gnostic Christianity on the basis of these and numerous other similarities. I have since backed away from this conclusion. And indeed, because of contemporary scholarship on this issue, I've backed away. If you're wondering where you can find that, you can find it in the introduction of his brand new book. And indeed, he even walked that back in a previous publication of his. The other problem we encounter here is when talking about other narratives of the Dormition, Shoemaker will call them orthodox. And of course, he will tell you orthodox compared to the ones that are heretical, that talk about the heretical notion of a sinful Saint Joseph and sinful Mary, which you're not going to find a single early father quoting from. So we don't believe Gavin is handling the material in a fair way.
Brian Daly, another fantastic scholar and a leading researcher on this question, puts the assumption coming into the church in the same broad time frame, though he thinks it starts among non-Chalcedonian Christians. And I've also referenced old.
As we heard directly from the lips of the Reverend Dr. Daly, he is being misrepresented here by Gavin. He believes that the story begins to take shape after Chalcedon. Not that it first appears, because he believes it has its origin liturgically in the early liturgy. But he believes it begins to take its shape. You find numerous scholars admitting that it'll begin to take shape, a particular fixed kind of narrative later on. There's no problem with that. But the idea that they believe it only appeared later, you don't have them saying that. But here's another problem. Dr. Ortlund claimed that scholarship believes that this originates in Gnosticism. Those are his words. His exact words are, scholarship believes that this, well, you know what? I don't want to misrepresent his words. Let's rewind.
Video. One of the points that I've made is that it appears to be something close to a scholarly consensus that the Assumption of Mary only comes into the church in the late 5th century, between 450 and 500, after the Council of Chalcedon. This is Stephen Shoemaker's summary. I'll put it up. He's a highly respected scholar working in this field. I won't read this. You can see this and numerous other quotes in my original videos. By the way, I am not misrepresenting him. People sometimes wrongly accuse me of that. This is a summary passage of the thesis of his book. It accords with numerous other passages, and I've emailed him to ask him to review my video to make sure that I'm summarizing him accurately, which he did. Shoemaker also suggests in about 6 or 8 other passages, I'll just put up one of them, that the assumption first appears to show up among Gnostic groups. And on pages 23 and 24 and 25 of this same book that I'm citing right here, he references widespread agreement about that point in the scholarship. The Roman Catholic scholar Brian Daly, the point is this. efforts to try to stretch the assumption back earlier by looking at traditions like this backfire, because the more weight you put on them, the more you make it look like Mary's assumption is a belief that arose first in Gnostic circles and then subsequently came into the church. And that's the same thing could be true, though I wouldn't use the word Gnostic necessarily, for the 4th century, late 4th century set of texts called the Six Books Dormition Apocryphon. Those are associated with the Collyridians, who are another heterodox group that Epiphanius opposes for their excessive devotion to Mary. It just looks, and honestly, a lot of the things he's opposing look like what would go under the label of hyperdulia or veneration to Mary today. And he sees it as idolatry. So the earlier you go, the more problematic that becomes. That is why the best of Roman Catholic defenses of the Assumption don't use those texts. Like the Assumption first appears to show up among Gnostic groups. And on pages 23 and 24 and 25 of this same book that I'm citing right here, he references widespread agreement about that point in the scholarship. The Roman
I'm going to pause right there because I did not want to misrepresent Gavin's words. Gavin will argue that the earliest evidence is heterodox. He will tell you that scholarship points to the earliest evidence of this being Gnostic without even being aware of Shoemaker's, not I want to say his latest work, but many years back. He walked back those Gnostic statements many years ago. Did it again in his latest book as well. If we want to talk about scholarship in the field of the Dormition and the Assumption, doesn't agree with you here, Gavin. And we're going to hear what the top scholars in the world on the Dormition and the Assumption think about your claims of it originating within Gnosticism. But there is indeed more, because we did a show with a great Reverend Dr. Daly in this particular topic, but we even did one with the great Dr. Brock. And we know very well that if any two incredible scholars are go-to titans in this area, it would be the great Reverend Dr. Daly and the great Dr. Brock. And we did get the chance to pick Dr. Brock's brain as to whether or not this has its origins within Gnosticism. Hear for yourself.
No, I agree. I definitely agree. Another thing that that I'd be very glad to dispel when I dialogued with the Reverend Dr. Daly, Dr. Katoots, and even Shoemaker, the one thing that I think people have become aware of that our evangelical friends have been claiming for a few years now, they have been claiming that the origin of these Syriac Dormition accounts find their origin within Gnosticism. And then they will then also go on to noting that Jacob and other figures are heterodox. I think, in my opinion, you tell me what you think, Dr. Brock, I think that the evangelical crusade against these Dormition and Assumption accounts really has perhaps led some to not understand the Christology of the Orientals, of the Oriental Orthodox Church, simply really not understanding that despite the fact that Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and Oriental are no longer fully united, that doesn't mean that St. Jacob and others had a heterodox theology. It doesn't mean their Christology is heterodox. Do you think maybe these arguments and claims from our evangelical friends really stem from them really not understanding the traditions?
I suspect it could be that. I think the Western Christians do find it very difficult to, as it were, cope with the way Christianity is presented in Eastern Christianity, and especially in the Syriac tradition, partly because it's in the Syriac tradition so much is expressed through poetry, and poetry, you need to have the right feel for it in order to understand what's going on. and one can read it and it means absolutely nothing to people. But if you read it with, Ephraim would say, if you don't read me with love, you won't understand me. And I think that's actually a rather good principle. And he also says that if you don't read the biblical text with love, it won't speak to you. Jacob has the biblical text answering back to a would-be reader of it. Says, if you don't love me, I'm not going to tell you my secrets.
Yeah.
And I think that is often the case, that you need to be open to a different way of looking at things. And certainly it is a different way, and not straightforward to jump into it from, say, an evangelical background.
Notice how when I bring up the Gnostic claim, before Dr. Brock agrees and refutes that, notice he gets a very nice wide-eyed grin there. The Reverend Dr. Daly just completely laughs it off. You're not going to find serious scholars arguing that this has its origin in Gnosticism. I'm done with that already. We're going to move on from it. If Dr. Ortlund would like to debate that, or to debate the Assumption of Mary, the Dormition, the Assumption, Gavin knows where to find me. We move on now.
Creed immediately adds, on the third day he rose again. By contrast, Epiphanius says nothing about a bodily assumption to heaven. That has to be read into the text. Epiphanius instead seems to consider the possibility of death, either by natural causes or martyrdom, as an alternative to her remaining alive. And then he says, we don't know. Nobody knows which of these is correct. In other words, when he says no one knows her end, he's not saying no one knows whether she died prior to an assumption. He just says, of these three options, nobody knows. And that's the result of a careful investigation. Okay? So people need to understand how big of a problem this is. It's not as though an assumption to heaven would be irrelevant to what Epiphanius is investigating. Supposing Mary had been buried and then resurrected and then assumed, that would give him the answer to the question he is searching for of what happened. Awareness of such a tradition would have presented him with an answer to the question he's searching for. Even, again, the Roman Catholic scholars admit this makes it look like there's not a generally known oral tradition about Mary's final lot at this time in the late 4th century. For example, Walter Burkhardt, who's a Roman Catholic scholar, says Epiphanius' approach suggests strongly the absence of a fixed tradition on Mary's final lot. That's especially the case because the Panarion was read widely throughout the church during Epiphanius' own lifetime. And yet, his findings appear to provoke no controversy and no counter-testimony. Andrew Jacobs notes that the Panarion circulated throughout the Christian world even during Epiphanius' lifetime and became the foundation text of subsequent pre-modern Christian heresiography. So basically you're wondering, okay, why, Now, some people argue that Epiphanius does affirm the assumption in the next chapter of Panarion. I'll address that. That'll be one of my things I address in this video, number 3 or something like that. Okay. So we're starting off, we're moving now.
Well, we're going to deal with that. Now, notice how very, very conveniently Dr. Ortlund will turn to the scholars only when they support him, but will clearly avoid him when they don't. The top Dormition and Assumption scholars in the world, the top ones, the top Mariologists in the world, the Reverend Dr. Kappas, the Reverend Dr. Daly, Shoemaker, they say that when they read Epiphanius, he teaches a bodily assumption of Mary. They're all against Ortlund. They are all against Gavin Ortlund. So Shoemaker is convenient to Gavin when he's convenient, even when he's convenient to Gavin, Gavin gets him wrong. There is a bodily assumption in St. Epiphanius or Epiphanius, however you want to read it. We're going to read that Panarion. By the way, yeah, he was agnostic about the Panarion originally, and then he agrees that now he realizes what happened to Mary at the end of her life. He's talking about the end of Mary's life. He agrees with multiple other individuals, multiple other, he would agree with the great Ephraim, the great Saint Ephraim, who would have predated him, whose writing we have. Now, poetic prose or not, Ephraim taught a bodily assumption. And we'd be willing to debate Gavin on that. Because there are multiple texts Gavin isn't even aware of in Ephraim that haven't been translated to English that we are aware of, where he very clearly talks about Holy Mary being Queen of Heaven, present bodily in heaven. But let's look at Epiphanius. And then how about we get to hear from the top scholarship in the world on the bodily assumption of Mary? How about we do that right afterwards? I can't wait for that. Right after we examine it. And I want you to look at it and I want you to tell me if we are giving it a fair assessment, or if you think Gavin's reading is a more logical one. You tell me what you think. We don't think Gavin's reading here is fair in any way. Very biased. Let's check out St. Epiphanius, the bodily assumption of Mary. Panarian 79. 78 is the one that deals with his agnosticism as to the end of Mary's life. But in 79, he tells you, yes, of course, Mary's body was holy, but she was not God. This is incredibly important because it shows you are to give Mary honor. You are to honor and venerate her, but not give her latria. So Gavin got that one wrong as well. When he said, well, this really does sound like hyperdulia, that the Collyridians were giving Mary that Epiphanius excoriates. No, it doesn't, because he tells you she was holy, but not God. What does that mean? That you give her honor, but you don't give her latria. He tells you, yes, the virgin was indeed honored. Yes, the virgin was indeed a virgin and honored as such, but she was not given us to worship. She worships him who, though born of her flesh, has come from heaven, from the bosom of his Father. So you're supposed to give her honor and veneration, but not worship. That's Catholic Theology 101. And the gospel, therefore, protects us by telling us so on the occasion when the Lord himself said, woman, what is between me and you? Mine hour is not yet come. To make sure that no one would suppose, because of the words, what is between me and you, that the Holy Virgin is anything more than a woman. He called her woman as if by prophecy, because of the schisms and sects that were to appear on earth. So she's mortal. She is mortal. She's not a deity. She is not to be worshipped. He tells us, for what this sect has to say is complete nonsense, as it were an old wives' tale. Check this out. Which scripture has spoken of it? Which prophet permitted the worship of a man? So this is talking about those that are mortal, those that clearly are creatures. Holy Mary is a creature not worthy of worship. Only God is to worship, let alone a woman. The vessel is choice, but a woman. And by nature, she is human, no different from others, meaning she's going to die like the others and like the bodies of the saints. However, remember, mortality is in view here. She has been held in honor for her character and understanding. And if I should say anything more in her praise, she is like Elijah. How is she like Elijah? Who was virgin from his mother's womb. She's perpetual virgin. Always remained so, and was taken up and has not seen death. Are you going to tell me that he's not including the final part? No, he's telling you, how is she like Elijah? She's like John, who leaned on the Lord's breast. Now, are you telling me, well, John never leaned on the Lord's breast? No, but our Lord leaned on her breast. You don't get the parallel? And the parallel is very clear here. How is the parallel between John and her? John leaned on the Lord's breast, and the Lord leaned on hers, the disciple whom Jesus loved. She is like Saint Thecla, an honored virgin, by the way. And Mary is still more honored than she because of the providence vouchsafed her. But Elijah is not to be worshipped. Remember, what is in view here is the dormition, even though he is alive. So he's alive in heaven. And John is not to be worshipped, even though by his own prayer, or rather by receiving the grace from God, he made an awesome thing of his dormition. There's a parallel with John. Multiple parallels with St. John. Multiple, but none of the saints are worthy of worship. None of them. But we're told because it says she's like John who leaned on the Lord's breast. She never leaned on our Lord's breast, so yeah, let's forget everything else. But that's not what Epiphanius is telling you. He's drawing parallels. How do they have parallels? Our Lord leaned on her breast. She's like John who leaned on the Lord's breast. Well, our Lord leaned on her breast. There's a parallel. And he believed in that miraculous dormition of John, which there's that parallel here of her holy dormition, her bodily assumption into heaven. So this is important because this is missed. But we're told to pay attention to the scholars. You got to pay attention to them. Pay attention to the scholarship on this issue, Gavin tells you. But does he? In his first account, from the letter to Arabia, by the way, this is Shoemaker, his dormition. As Epiphanius excoriates the Collyridian rituals, he turns suddenly to the question of the end of Mary's life, professing the strict agnosticism on this subject for which he has become so famous in various modern studies on the dormition and assumption. Without making any transition to a new topic, he writes, the Holy Virgin may have died and been buried. Her falling asleep was with honor, her death in purity, her crown in virginity, or she may have been put to death, as Scripture says, and a sword shall pierce through her soul. Her fame is among the martyrs, and her body, by which light rose in the world, rests amid blessings. Or she remained alive, for God is not incapable of doing whatever he wills. No one knows her end. And we do know that there were heterodox groups. We know of a heterodox individual whose writings do exist, where he argued that Mary did have a martyr's death. Very interesting tradition that you only find in heterodoxy. But we continue. Epiphanius then continues his attack on the Collyridians further, offering no explanation for his introduction of this topic and leaving the unmistakable impression that his discussion of the dormition has something to do with the Collyridians. The overall effect is to link his opponent's bread offerings in Mary's honor with the 6 books, with a question of how her life ended, a pairing that certainly suggests a connection with the 6 books Apocrypha. Similar association between the Collyridians' veneration of Mary and the Virgin's dormition occurs in the penultimate section of the Panarion, which is dedicated exclusively to the refutation of this Marian heresy. After denouncing the Collyridian practice of allowing female clergy, Epiphanius eventually comes to address their bread offerings to the Virgin, which he attacks by comparing Mary with Elijah, John, and Thecla. In this way, he continues his apparent strategy of undermining this veneration of the Virgin through a broader attack against veneration of the saints. The main point here is that just as Elijah, John, and Thecla are not venerated, using such blasphemous ritual practices, so there's no basis for the Collyridian veneration of Mary. Thecla's appearance in this context is to be expected, since she had long served as a primary role model for female virginity. Let's go on. Look at this. Instead, Epiphanius' comparisons with Elijah and John focus squarely in the miraculous manner in which each ended his life. Mary is like Elijah, he explains, in that he was a virgin from his mother's womb, remained so perpetually, and was assumed analambanomenos, and has not seen death. Although this passage has been frequently overlooked in various studies of the Virgin's dormition and assumption, the last 2 points deserve particular emphasis. So if you want to stick to the scholarship on the dormition and the assumption, you've got it here. It doesn't agree with you, Dr. Ortlund. Let me add another figure that doesn't agree with you, Dr. Caduce. who's very clearly told me you're out of touch with scholarship in this issue. I'll be doing a show with her soon, God willing. In contrast with the guarded agnosticism of the letter to Arabia, which previous scholarship has overwhelmingly taken as evidence that Epiphanius knew no tradition of the end of Mary's life, here he rather unambiguously proclaims that Mary, like Elijah, was assumed that has not seen death. Moreover, he makes this assertion in the context of rebutting the Coloridian liturgical practices, again suggesting his awareness of a link between these rituals and a tradition about the end of Mary's life. This connection is reinforced by his comparison between Mary and John, when he invokes John's miraculous dormition, arguing that John is not to be venerated, even through his own prayer, or rather by receiving grace from God, he made of his falling asleep, coin mason, an amazing thing. Here Epiphanius refers to the various traditions of John's metastasis and the miraculous removal of his body from this world of death that had begun to circulate already in several versions by this time. Thus again, without much explanation, Epiphanius returns to the theme of Mary's dormition. Remember, again he returns to it, of the theme of Mary's dormition in his assault on the Coloridian ritual practices. His deployment of traditions regarding the miraculous endings of Elijah's and John's lives in the context of attacking the Coloridian veneration of Mary suggests even more strongly connection between these bread offerings and a tradition of Mary's dormition. Incredible. So we've got Epiphanius recognizing that Holy Mary was bodily assumed into heaven. Indeed, if we're going to deal with the top scholarship in this field, those that are actual scholars that have translated the material have published on this, why not follow what they tell us about the assumption about St. Epiphanius? Shoemaker doesn't agree with you, Gavin. What about the Reverend Dr. Daly, who has translated the very best of the Dormition and Assumption Fathers into a magnificent patristic volume? Does he agree with you, Dr. Ortlund? Now, before I did this show with the great Reverend Dr. Daly, I had dialogued with him and spoke to him about how blown away I was at how St. Epiphanius previously was agnostic to the end of Holy Mary's life. But then we get in Panarian 79 very clearly a clear attestation to the end of Mary's life, and that is a holy dormition, bodily assumption into heaven. And we'll hear what the great Reverend Dr. Daly, scholar extraordinaire, who Gavin loves to quote, what he has to say about Epiphanius.
Now, I remember the last time we did the show, we spoke about it briefly, and like I said, this is one of my favorite topics, so I love talking about this all the time. You know, in the previous show we did, we briefly touched upon the great St. Epiphanius, and we talked about how there was a moment there which he became very famous for, where he spoke of his agnosticism towards the end of Mary's life. We really don't know what happened, and as far as I know, he's one of the first fathers. I don't know if he's the first. He's one of the first that will connect Mary with the figure of the woman in Revelation 12. So that's also quite significant. And he does that in his Panarian. And so he became very famous for that, as you know very well, Father. But then, as we talked about it before as well, later in his Panarian 79, seems like he does reach a certain kind of conclusion as to the end of Mary's life. And I remember our conversation, I've looked at the Reverend Dr. Coppas and Shoemaker, who don't know why, but they note that he had a change in his position. And now he's talking about Mary being assumed into heaven. Do you think, Father, that this could be because he was a great historian? What would bring about a change in such a position?
It's hard to know. I mean, I think they all assume that Mary, as the most holy human being, the mother of God, that she is with God in heaven, that she's reached fulfillment, the kind of fulfillment that we hope for. But
noting how this particular belief was established very early on in Orthodox Christian communities. And it really does seem clear to me that this is rooted in early Orthodoxy. And then at times, which is an unfortunate thing, we encounter perhaps people that have not really done deep research or not very well learned on the issue, trying to argue that the belief is rooted in Gnosticism, which to me is really, really shocking, Father, because the great Dormition and Assumption Fathers, they repudiated that heresy.
Sure.
Father, does that have any logic to it?
Yeah, I don't know where that comes from. Why people, it's not a Gnostic type of belief. The Gnostics believe that the world we live in is not real in the same sense that ordinary people do, and they believe that occult rites can give you control over your existence. But Mary, the death of Mary, the passing of Mary into God's presence is not ever presented in that sense. She lives a human life, and her death is the end of her human life. So if anything is anti-Gnostic, she doesn't simply go on at a different plane. She really dies, and in that is taken up by God's grace into His glory and His peace. And that is offered in the homilies as kind of a model for our death, which we hope to share in. So if we read John of Damascus or any of the other early preachers on the death of Mary, it's really a real death, but it's for us, it's a model for us, not to fear death, but to give our lives into God's hands.
Yeah. And you knowing very well Trinitarian theology and how incredibly orthodox these great Dormition fathers were, Andrew of Crete, Germanus, John of Damascus, and others, it would be shocking to me at least, and I'm sure to you as well, to assume that they would be duped into adopting a Gnostic tradition when they were so strong in their Trinitarian belief and in their Christology. It would be shockingly absurd, wouldn't it, Father?
It would, and if anything, I think the Gnostic approach, Gnostic mentality, would not want to admit her dying at all, but they would see her in some sense being transported or transformed from one plane of living to another. And that's not what the Domitian homilies or narratives say to us. She genuinely dies, but in that death, she is taken up into the life of God, and her body too is taken up. Her tomb is empty, but it's not a Gnostic idea at all.
Yeah, and I think you would know who you've translated. You've got, in my opinion, you've got the magnum opus book on the Dormition, the Assumption. So you would know that because you've translated the homilies, haven't you, Father?
Right. Yeah, the homilies that we included in there are all by genuinely and outstandingly orthodox preachers and theologians. People like Germanus of Constantinople, and especially John of Damascus, who is a model for Western as well as Eastern Orthodoxy. Somebody that St. Thomas quotes more than anybody else. John of Damascus has 3 homilies on the Dormition of Mary, which are beautiful things, and kind of a standard explanation and narration of what happens, what we celebrate. But it's certainly the opposite of a Gnostic approach to life and death.
We've got to pause for a moment here and put the things in a little bit of perspective. Number one, the Reverend Dr. Daly has examined the text, has looked at the text, and he recognizes very clearly that Saint Epiphanius is no longer agnostic on this particular point, that he indeed does believe in the bodily assumption of Holy Mary. Now, that is the number one thing I want to put forth. If we're going to deal with the very best scholarship on this issue, if we're going to deal with the top scholarship on the issue, then we've got to listen to what those that have actually studied the matter have to say on this issue. And we're going to hear, again, I've rewound it a little bit because I want to hear everything in the context here. What does the great Reverend Dr. Daly have to say about this?
What would bring about a change in such a position?
But it's hard to know. I mean, I think they all assume that Mary, as the most holy human being, the mother of God, that she is with God in heaven, that she's reached fulfillment, the kind of fulfillment that we hope for, but that she participates in first. So they're assuming Mary is in heaven.
Yeah.
How did she get there? She's not God. She's a creature. So God has to bring her up. She has to be taken up into heaven by God's intervention. And what we celebrate here is that at the end of her life, she's buried and then taken up by God's grace and is transformed, but is still completely dependent on God's love.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know the one thing that amazes me, and I put it in the screen, the text, how there's a tradition. Of course, it's an apocryphal tradition of the falling asleep of John, of the Apostle John. But interestingly, you will find Epiphanius drawing a parallel there. So even in Epiphanius, and even in all of the fathers that I've encountered, they believe Mary had an end to her life. So
Right.
there's an end to Mary's life. There's, of course, an assumption. Now, in my opinion, people, when you encounter Epiphanius, John, and many others, St. John Damascene, we really don't quite know how Mary was bodily assumed. So, in my opinion, that's what leads to their speculations in their Dormition homilies of saying, well, if Mary was all holy, well, of course, when she was assumed, all the heavenly host would have applauded and would have been in joy. So, which would make sense to me, but perhaps because we don't know exactly every detail that went down, do you think that maybe that is why they speculate as to what could have occurred?
I think that's right. I mean, how do we know how any of us enter into the presence of God?
Well, the Reverend Dr. Daly, what a great point he does bring up, but great point that he does bring up after affirming that indeed the Saint Epiphanius does believe in the bodily assumption. So if we want to go with what scholarship says, if we want to go with scholarship on this issue of the dormition and the bodily assumption of Holy Mary have to say, then we have to look elsewhere than what Gavin is putting forth. Unfortunately, what Gavin is presenting for us is a position that is Protestant, that is untenable, that you don't even find the early reformers or the early forerunners of the Reformation holding to. You have, speaking of accretions, this is a very late accretion. This is very late in history where we have the denial in the bodily assumption of Holy Mary. It comes up very late. It is indeed a product of the ever-evolving world of the Reformation, of the ever-evolving world of Reformed theology, and it is something that we simply cannot get on board with.
Christian can accept the assumption of Mary without external confirmation on the authority of the Church. But these two events are disanalogous because the Exodus took place 12 or 14 centuries earlier, when we have much less historical documentation of any kind. So it's much less surprising that we wouldn't have external confirmation. But in the case of Mary's assumption, it's very surprising because we have not only numerous references to Mary's death, as we've seen, people searching for traditions about what happened to her at the end of her life, but we also have numerous lists of the people that are understood to have been assumed bodily to heaven.
Now, we're going to look at these supposed lists of people that are bodily assumed into heaven that Gavin Ortlund does bring up. We're going to look at that in part 2, and indeed part 2 is going to be just on that. Indeed, Gavin is really playing fast and loose there with the info. There is no such thing as, all these tons of lists of people that catalog everybody that was bodily assumed into heaven. He's playing tricks on you there. If you take him seriously there, well, we've already seen where his scholarship leads. We've already seen how he simply does not handle the material well at all. So I'm telling you right now, stay tuned for part 2, which will be coming in a few days. Again, if you're a patron, thank you so much. You have access to this immediately. This will air several days later, publicly via Premiere. If you have access, if you are a patron, you have access to part 2. just one day later. So thank you so much. Part 2 will be out tomorrow if you're a patron. If not, in a few days, once you see this premiere, which likely is premiering Thursday evening, should be Thursday evening, you'll be seeing the premiere of part 2 on either Tuesday or Wednesday of the following week. And we'll go deep into the so-called lists, those lists of those that were bodily assumed. But before we even get into that, we had Dr. Ortlund will say some other things. We're going to hear what else he has to say.
These, when Tertullian is expounding the perfection of the resurrection body. For example, the Dormition homily of Jacob of Serug in around 489 references the seraphim escorting Mary's soul into heaven, but it says nothing about her body. There's lots of these traditions you find with just an assumption of her soul only.
We're going to look at the actual text of St. Jacob of Serug, and I will leave it up to you to decide whether or not there is a bodily assumption here or a mere soul assumption. And then after I leave that up to you, we're going to hear from the top scholar on the planet on St. Jacob of Serug. Indeed, we're going to hear from another mega Syriac giant, great scholar in the great Syriac apologist, Subdeacon Daniel Kakish, and the Syriac scholar, Dr. Sebastian Brock. We'll hear their thoughts in St. Jacob after we go through this. Death came that she might taste his cup. The Lord commanded the exalted hosts above and the flaming legions, the seraphim of light. This is true, those in heaven would glory at the arrival of Mary, Holy Mary. On this day, Adam rejoices and Eve, his wife, because their daughter rests in the place where they are gathered. On this day, the righteous Noah and Abraham rejoice that their daughter has visited them in their dwelling place. On this day, let also Judah rejoice greatly, for behold, the daughter who has given life went forth from his loins. On this day, let Joseph rejoice, and the great Moses, for one young maiden has called all mankind to life. Come, Ezekiel, train to prophetic revelation. If the thing that has occurred is described in your prophecy, on this day, let also Isaiah the prophet rejoice. How incredible is that? Because she whom he prophesied, behold, she visits him in the place of the dead. On this day, all the prophets lifted their heads from their graves because they saw the light which shone forth on them. They saw that death is disquieted and flees from within them, and the gates of heaven are open again in the depths of the earth. She wove a beautiful crown and set it on her sublime head, on which valuable pearls were laid. This is of the physical nature. This crown is physical imagery in the head, the sublime head. You don't only have a soul assumption here. This is physical imagery. One of the great things that we posed to Dr. Brock was, well, we read the homily or portions of it for the great Dr. Brock, who was the top scholar on Jacob in the world. And we read it for him and we say, well, look, he doesn't say physical, he doesn't mention body, but everything really does lead us to believe that this is of the physical nature. I mean, everything really does lead us to believe it. And Dr. Brock will come out and flat out say, well, he doesn't need to say body or physical. He was aware of the tradition. His audience would have known it. Look at what Dr. Brock has to say.
That for Jacob's audience, they already knew the tradition. So he didn't actually need to say anything. So you can argue these things both ways often. But as I say,
So Dr. Brock tells you that, look, he would have known the tradition. So people would say, well, you can't prove anything bodily here. You can't do that because there's no word body there, or he just doesn't give you any indication that it's anything other than the soul. But as Dr. Brock says, he would have known the tradition. So you can argue it both ways. And indeed, look at what Subdeacon says and Dr. Brock agrees with. Look at this.
I think, in my opinion, it's clear for the reader who's who's not trying to kind of how do I say, play devil's advocate or something, because
Yes, yes.
it's talking about
Did you catch that? Dr. Brock agrees with him. Subdeacon Daniel says, look, it's clear for those that are not trying to, play devil's advocate. The plain reading is of the physical nature. Dr. Brock agrees. He nods his head. He agrees. I agree. And Subdeacon will go deeper.
who's not trying to kind of how do I say, play devil's advocate or something, because
Yes, yes.
it's talking about crowning her, and it's talking about physical things. So
Yes.
And Dr. Brock agrees. Yes, he agrees. The plain reading is of St. Jacob teaching about the bodily assumption of Holy Mary. There's not only a mere soul assumption there. I'll take it from the one who is the master of the Syriac fathers, the master of St. Jacob of Saruk. I'll take his word over Gavin's any day of the week. As we round off part one, I hope you've been incredibly edified. Do me a favor, let me know down below if you've been edified. Have you liked the presentation? We're onward to part two. It'll be out very, very soon. And if you've enjoyed it, please let us know down below. Leave a comment, share, subscribe, hit like. Help the algorithm and let me know down below if you enjoyed it. What would you like in part two? And part three, we're going to do a part two and a part three. We've got a lot more to come, including a mega presentation against a top Protestant apologist in Spanish on the Assumption of Mary and Queenship of Mary. We are not slowing down. Multiple debates, multiple book projects we're working on, a bunch of talks, a lot of material, and a lot of exclusive courses, theology courses with scholars, and with me opening up my apologetics brain for you over there in Patreon. If you're not a patron yet or a member of the channel, support us in any way you can. If you cannot support that way, pray for me. Pray for me. Pray for my family. God bless you. God keep you. Love you.